Welcome back to Bible in a Year. I'm glad that you came back. Today we begin looking at the New Testament, starting with the Gospels. And virtually all that we know about the earthly ministry of Jesus is recorded in these four Gospels. And the word gospel is from an Anglo-Saxon word that means God's story. Isn't that cool? The Greek word for it is evangelion. And what it means is a good message or a happy message. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they're the three Gospels that are taking the same point of view. They're the three Gospels that are alike. They're known as the Synoptic Gospels. And then there is John, also known as the fourth Gospel. John has his own perspective on the same story. Why are there four Gospels and not one or not seven? Ooh, that is a good question. That is such a good question. And what you should do is you should Google canon of the New Testament. C-A-N-O-N. Canon of the New Testament. And then you'll see how huge that question is that you have asked, and you can get some information to answer it. Today, what we're going to be doing is looking briefly, very briefly, at the Gospel according to St. Matthew. We learn in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, and chapter 10, verse 3, that Matthew, who's also called Levi in Mark chapter 3:15, was a hated tax collector before becoming one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Now, the reason the people of God hated these tax collectors so much is mostly the fault of the Romans. The Romans would say, all right, out of the region of Caesarea, we need to collect $1 million in taxes. And then people would bid for the right to collect the $1 million. And let's say somebody got the bid for $5 million. Then the Romans take the $5 million and they're happy because they've got their taxes. And the tax collector is happy because he's got some Roman soldiers to go with him as he goes door to door and knocks on them and collects the taxes. And so he could end up collecting $10 million in taxes out of the region around Caesarea. So, of course, the people just hated the tax collectors because they were more likely known as the tax gougers because, of course, that's what they were. Now, there are some things that you should know about this gospel. The first thing you should know is that Matthew's gospel was written especially to the Jews, to convince the Jews that Jesus is the long-expected Messiah, that he's the one all of the prophets have been speaking about. And so in Matthew, there's like 130 times where Matthew talks about how Jesus fulfilled prophecy. So the first thing you need to remember is that Matthew was written especially to the Jews. The second thing you need to remember is that Matthew sees Jesus as the Son of God, who is like a new Moses. He's the Son of God, but he's also like a new Moses. And where Moses has the 5 books of the Torah that he wrote, we have Jesus who has given the 5 discourses. And the first one is the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. And then there's the Mission Discourse, chapters 10 to 12. And then there's the discourse of the 7 parables, all of chapter 13. And then there is the discourse of the community rule, all of chapter 18. And then there's the apocalyptic discourse, chapters 24 and 25. These are 5 discourses, and they're big, and they're pretty important. Matthew also stresses the need to understand the word, not just hear it. And another thing that you should know is that Matthew's account of Jesus' birth is the one that emphasizes the coming of the astrologers, the Magi, the wise men, to worship the King of the Jews. And this is also a fulfillment of prophecy. If you look at Numbers 24, verse 17, Balaam says, I see him, but not near. I see him coming, but not here. And he talks about his star and his scepter. And it's really cool. This is Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. And the coming of the Magi is also a fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah 60, verses 1 through 6, where it talks about how the Gentiles will come bearing gifts, gold and incense, to Zion. This is wonderful stuff. As you're reading it, be sure to notice how much Matthew just assumes that his readers are going to be familiar with the terms he's using, are familiar with the importance of the law, that they know their Bibles, that they're familiar with the geography of Palestine. And because he assumes all this, we know that he is writing to the Jews, that he has a Jewish readership, that he wants to convince that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. And a final thought. This gospel has been called the gospel of the church. Matthew is the only gospel that uses the word church, the ecclesia, the called out ones. Matthew is the only one that uses the term church, and Matthew only uses it after Jesus' teaching concerning the kingdom of heaven has been rejected, and it's at that point that he starts talking about the church. And also, when you see the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew, that's Matthew 14, verses 13 to 21. Notice how we are also seeing the church at worship. Have fun with Matthew, read it, and we will talk about it when we get together. Thanks a lot.